Jesus never denied the reality of suffering. He never told people that pain was an illusion, never asked them to hide their tears, and never taught that faith meant pretending everything was fine. Instead, Jesus acknowledged suffering openly, honestly, and deeply. From the very beginning of his life on earth, he stepped into a world filled with pain. He was born not into comfort, but into poverty, not into safety, but into danger, not into praise, but into uncertainty. This alone teaches us something powerful. God did not enter the world to escape suffering. He entered the world to understand it. Throughout his life, Jesus encountered suffering everywhere he went. He saw the sick who were rejected by society, the poor who were invisible to the powerful, and the grieving who had lost hope. And he did not turn away. Jesus stopped, Jesus listened, and Jesus stayed. One of the most moving moments in the life of Jesus is found at the tomb of Lazarus. Lazarus was his friend, and Jesus knew that Lazarus would be raised from the dead. He knew the miracle was coming, and yet Jesus wept. He did not say, "Stop crying," and he did not say, "This pain doesn't matter." He stood in the middle of human grief and allowed himself to feel it. This moment reveals something profound about God. If Jesus, knowing the outcome, still wept, then tears are not a sign of weak faith. Tears are a sign of love. Jesus showed us that suffering is not something to deny, suppress, or minimize, but something to acknowledge. Jesus himself experienced physical suffering. He knew hunger after fasting in the wilderness, exhaustion after long days of teaching and healing, and pain after being beaten and crucified. He also experienced emotional suffering. He was misunderstood by his own family, rejected by religious leaders, betrayed by a close friend, and abandoned by his disciples in his darkest hour. Jesus understands what it feels like to be left alone. When you feel misunderstood, Jesus understands. When you feel rejected, Jesus understands. When you feel abandoned, Jesus understands. One of the greatest lies people believe is that faith means being strong all the time. But Jesus never taught that. Instead, he showed vulnerability, sorrow, anguish, and tears. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. He prayed, he struggled, and he asked God if there was another way. This moment tells us something deeply comforting. Feeling overwhelmed does not mean you lack faith. And struggling does not mean you have failed God. Even Jesus struggled. Jesus never asked people to deny their suffering in order to come to God. He invited the weary, welcomed the broken, and embraced the wounded. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." This invitation was not for the strong, but for the exhausted. Jesus acknowledged suffering because he knew healing begins with honesty. Pain that is hidden grows heavier, but pain brought into the light can begin to heal. Faith, according to Jesus, is not about appearing unbroken. It is about bringing your brokenness to God. By acknowledging suffering, Jesus gave humanity permission to be human. He showed us that God is not offended by our pain, not distant from our tears, and not silent in our suffering. Jesus did not say, "Be strong and deal with it." He said, "Come to me," and in that invitation, there is compassion, understanding, and hope. One of the most damaging beliefs about suffering is the idea that pain is always a punishment from God. Many people silently believe that if something goes wrong in their life, it must mean they have failed, sinned, or disappointed God in some way. This belief has caused countless people to live in shame, fear, and spiritual exhaustion. Jesus directly confronted this belief, not with anger, but with truth. Throughout his teachings, Jesus made it clear that suffering is not always connected to personal sin, and pain is not proof of God's rejection. One powerful moment occurs when Jesus and his disciples encounter a man who is blind from birth. The disciples immediately ask a familiar question: who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? This question reveals how deeply ingrained this belief was, even among those closest to Jesus. Pain, in their minds, had to be someone's fault. Jesus' response completely overturns this way of thinking. He says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." With these words, Jesus separates suffering from blame. He does not explain the origin of the suffering, but he removes the burden of guilt. Jesus shows us that not every hardship has a moral cause, and not every wound is a punishment. This teaching is deeply liberating. It tells us that suffering does not automatically mean we are spiritually failing. Many people carry an invisible weight, constantly asking themselves what they did wrong to deserve their pain. Jesus lifts that weight. He teaches that suffering can exist without condemnation. Throughout his ministry, Jesus consistently refused to shame the suffering. When he encountered the sick, he did not accuse them. When he met the broken, he did not interrogate them. He healed without first demanding explanations. This matters because shame multiplies pain. When people believe their suffering is punishment, they turn inward, hide, and withdraw from God. Jesus did the opposite. He moved toward those in pain and removed their shame. Another moment that reveals this truth is found when Jesus speaks about tragedies. He references a tower that collapsed and killed several people. Many assumed those who died must have been worse sinners. Jesus rejects this assumption and says they were not more guilty than anyone else. Through this teaching, Jesus makes it clear that tragedy is not a scoreboard of righteousness. Life's suffering is not distributed based on moral rankings. This directly challenges the idea that good lives are always protected from pain. Jesus knew that such thinking would crush the human spirit. If people believe pain is always punishment, then suffering becomes unbearable, because it carries not only hurt but also condemnation. Jesus removed that burden. He taught that pain does not mean God has turned away. Another powerful example is found in how Jesus treated sinners who were already suffering. The woman caught in adultery was brought before him. Surrounded by accusation and condemnation, Jesus did not deny her wrongdoing, but he refused to reduce her identity to her sin. He said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." This moment reveals something essential. Jesus distinguishes between accountability and condemnation. Even when sin is present, suffering is not meant to be a tool of humiliation. God's desire is restoration, not punishment for its own sake. Jesus also spoke directly against the belief that wealth and comfort are signs of God's approval, while suffering is a sign of God's displeasure. In his time, many believed that prosperity meant righteousness. Jesus challenged this again and again. He said the poor were blessed, the mourners were comforted, and the meek would inherit the earth. Through these teachings, Jesus dismantled the idea that suffering equals spiritual failure. Instead, he showed that God's closeness is often found in places of weakness. Jesus himself is the ultimate proof that suffering is not punishment. He lived without sin, yet experienced immense pain. He was rejected, beaten, mocked, and crucified. If suffering were always punishment, then the life of Jesus would make no sense. His suffering reveals a deeper truth. Pain can exist alongside righteousness. This changes how we see our own suffering. When life becomes difficult, Jesus does not ask us to search endlessly for hidden guilt. He asks us to trust God's presence within the pain. Jesus knew how destructive shame-based faith could be. A faith built on fear collapses under suffering, but a faith built on love can endure pain without losing hope. By separating suffering from punishment, Jesus restored dignity to the hurting. He allowed people to suffer without feeling abandoned by God. This teaching is especially important for those who feel spiritually exhausted. Many people pray less when they suffer because they believe God is disappointed in them. Jesus corrects that lie. He shows that suffering is often the very place where God draws closest. This does not mean suffering is good or desired. Jesus never glorified pain. He healed it, relieved it, and mourned it, but he refused to weaponize it. He refused to turn pain into evidence of divine rejection. Jesus teaches us that suffering is part of a broken world, not a measurement of our worth. The absence of comfort does not mean the absence of God. When Jesus removed punishment from suffering, he gave humanity something precious: permission to seek God without fear. Instead of asking, "What did I do wrong?" we are invited to ask, "Where is God with me right now?" This shift changes everything. It transforms suffering from a courtroom into a place of encounter. Jesus taught that God is not standing over us with judgment in our pain. God is standing beside us with compassion. This teaching does not answer every question about why suffering exists, but it answers the most important one. God's heart toward the suffering is not anger, but mercy. When Jesus taught that suffering is not always punishment, he freed humanity from one of its deepest spiritual burdens. Pain no longer had to mean rejection. Tears no longer had to mean failure. Suffering could be endured without shame. And in that freedom, healing becomes possible. One of the most powerful and comforting teachings of Jesus about suffering is this truth: God is not distant from human pain. Many people imagine God as watching suffering from far away, observing from heaven while humanity struggles below. But Jesus shattered that image completely. Through his life, Jesus revealed a God who enters suffering, not a God who avoids it. Jesus did not remain in comfort while others hurt. He walked directly into broken places, sat with the wounded, and touched lives marked by pain. When Jesus healed the sick, he did not do it from a distance. He touched lepers who had not felt human contact in years. He spoke to outcasts whom society had silenced. He allowed the pain of others to interrupt his plans. This teaches us that God's presence is not removed by suffering. In fact, suffering often becomes the place where God draws closest. Jesus showed that God does not abandon people in their darkest moments. Instead, God meets them there. This truth becomes even clearer as Jesus approaches the cross. As the weight of suffering increased, Jesus did not escape it. He moved forward willingly, knowing the pain that awaited him. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed in deep anguish. His soul was overwhelmed with sorrow. He experienced fear, distress, and emotional pain so intense that his sweat fell like drops of blood. This moment is crucial because it reveals that Jesus did not bypass suffering through divine power. He felt it fully. He carried anxiety, dread, and sorrow, just as humans do. Yet even in this moment, Jesus remained in relationship with God. He prayed, he cried out, he surrendered. This teaches us that God's presence does not mean the absence of pain. It means companionship within pain. When Jesus was arrested, beaten, mocked, and condemned, he experienced injustice. He suffered at the hands of political power, religious hypocrisy, and human cruelty. Many people suffer not because they did wrong, but because others abused power. Jesus understands that kind of suffering intimately. He knows what it means to be falsely accused, unfairly treated, and publicly humiliated. On the cross, Jesus experienced the deepest form of suffering a human can know: abandonment. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These words are not a loss of faith. They are a quotation from the Psalms, a prayer spoken from the depths of pain. In that cry, Jesus entered the experience of those who feel abandoned by God. This is one of the most radical truths of Christianity. God himself chose to experience the feeling of God forsaken-ness. That means no human suffering is foreign to God. There is no pain too dark, no despair too deep, and no loneliness too severe for God to understand. Jesus' presence on the cross tells us that when we suffer, we are not alone. Even when God feels silent, he is still present. Silence does not mean absence. Jesus showed us that God's presence is sometimes quiet, hidden, and mysterious, but never withdrawn. After his resurrection, Jesus still bore the wounds of suffering. The scars remained. This teaches us something important. God does not erase suffering as if it never happened. Instead, he transforms it. The wounds of Jesus became signs of victory, not shame. In the same way, God can be present in our suffering without immediately removing it. Sometimes God's presence looks like strength to endure rather than rescue from pain. Jesus taught us that suffering does not separate us from God. It becomes the place where God reveals his deepest love. When you suffer, God is not watching from a distance. He is with you, closer than you realize, walking beside you, carrying you when you are too weak to walk yourself. Jesus never taught that suffering is good in itself, but he consistently taught that suffering can shape the human heart in ways comfort never can. In a world that avoids pain at all costs, Jesus revealed a deeper truth. Transformation often comes through hardship. When Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted," he was not celebrating sorrow, but revealing what sorrow can open within the soul. Mourning softens the heart. It strips away illusions of control and self-sufficiency. It reminds us of our dependence on God and our need for one another. Jesus understood that suffering has the power to awaken compassion. Those who have suffered deeply often recognize pain in others more quickly. They listen more carefully. They love more gently. Jesus himself was described as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and through that grief, his heart remained open rather than hardened. This is one of the greatest lessons Jesus taught about suffering. Pain can either close the heart or expand it. The difference lies in where we turn with our pain. When suffering is met with bitterness, it hardens the soul. When suffering is brought to God, it can refine the soul. Jesus used suffering to teach humility. He warned that wealth, success, and comfort can blind people to spiritual truth. Hardship, however, has a way of revealing what truly matters. When everything else is stripped away, the heart becomes clearer. Jesus taught that suffering can reorder our priorities. What once seemed important loses its grip. Love, mercy, and faith rise to the surface. Through suffering, many people discover that their identity is not rooted in achievement, status, or approval, but in being loved by God. Jesus also taught that suffering can produce endurance and spiritual maturity. He spoke of carrying one's cross daily, not as a symbol of despair, but as a path of growth. Carrying the cross means learning to trust God when answers are absent and outcomes are uncertain. It means choosing faith when feelings fail. Jesus never promised that suffering would make sense in the moment, but he taught that faithfulness within suffering has lasting impact. Even unseen suffering has value. Jesus noticed the quiet endurance of the poor widow, the silent faith of the sick, and the perseverance of those who remained faithful without recognition. He showed that God sees what the world overlooks. One of the most radical teachings of Jesus is that suffering can become a place of blessing. Not because pain is desirable, but because God can meet us there in unique ways. Comfort often leads to complacency, but suffering awakens longing for God. It deepens prayer. It sharpens awareness of eternity. Jesus taught that a transformed heart does not emerge from avoiding pain, but from walking through pain with God. The heart shaped by suffering becomes more compassionate, more patient, and more grounded in truth. Jesus did not rush people out of their pain. He walked with them until transformation took root. This teaches us that growth takes time. Healing is often slow, but nothing offered to God is wasted. Suffering placed in God's hands becomes soil where faith grows deeper, love grows stronger, and the heart becomes more like Christ. One of the most radical and uncomfortable teachings of Jesus about suffering is how he completely redefined strength. The world defines strength as control, dominance, independence, and the ability to avoid pain. Strength, according to human logic, means winning, conquering, and never appearing weak. Jesus turned this definition upside down. Through his words, his actions, and ultimately his suffering, Jesus revealed that true strength is not found in avoiding pain but in how one carries it. Jesus consistently resisted displays of power that impressed crowds but left hearts unchanged. When tempted to prove his strength through miracles meant only to impress, he refused. When offered political power, he rejected it. When mocked on the cross and challenged to save himself, he remained. This restraint was not weakness. It was strength under control. Jesus showed that strength is not the absence of vulnerability but the courage to remain faithful while vulnerable. Throughout his ministry, Jesus elevated qualities the world considers weak. He praised the meek, the merciful, and the humble. He told his followers to love their enemies, forgive endlessly, and serve rather than rule. These teachings are impossible without inner strength. Forgiveness requires more strength than revenge. Endurance requires more strength than escape. Love in the face of suffering requires more courage than retaliation. Jesus embodied this strength most clearly in his suffering. As he carried the cross, he did not lash out in anger or seek revenge. He endured humiliation, pain, and injustice without surrendering to hatred. This teaches us that strength is not measured by how much pain we can inflict, but by how much love we can preserve in the midst of pain. On the cross, Jesus spoke words that redefined power forever. He prayed for those who crucified him. He showed compassion to a dying criminal. He entrusted his spirit to God. These were not the actions of a defeated man. They were the actions of someone fully aligned with divine strength. Jesus taught that suffering exposes what kind of strength we rely on. When comfort is stripped away, when control is lost, when answers disappear, what remains reveals the foundation of the soul. Those who rely solely on external strength collapse when suffering comes. Those rooted in God discover a deeper strength that endures. Jesus described this strength when he said that whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for his sake will find it. This paradox lies at the heart of his teaching. Letting go appears weak, yet it leads to life. Surrender appears like defeat, yet it opens the door to transformation. Jesus did not teach passive suffering or glorify abuse. He taught willing sacrifice rooted in love and truth. There is a profound difference between being harmed and choosing to love in the face of harm. Jesus chose the cross, not because he lacked power, but because love demanded it. This teaches us that strength is not about avoiding suffering at all costs, but about choosing what is worth suffering for. Jesus also taught that strength is often quiet and unseen. He noticed the strength of the widow who gave her last coin. He honored the perseverance of the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. He revealed that heaven measures strength differently than the world. Enduring silently, remaining faithful without recognition, and continuing to love without reward require extraordinary strength. Jesus redefined victory itself. Victory was not avoiding death but overcoming fear. It was not escaping suffering but redeeming it. Through his resurrection, Jesus showed that suffering embraced with love does not have the final word. Strength, according to Jesus, is the ability to trust God even when the outcome is uncertain, to remain obedient even when the cost is high, and to love even when suffering wounds the heart. This kind of strength cannot be produced by willpower alone. It is formed through relationship with God. Jesus did not shame human weakness. He met it with compassion. He invited the weak, the broken, and the weary to come to him, not to become instantly strong, but to receive strength. This teaches us that true strength is not self-generated. It is received. It flows from dependence on God rather than independence from him. When Jesus fell under the weight of the cross, he did not lose strength. He revealed it by continuing forward despite exhaustion, pain, and humiliation. He showed that perseverance itself is strength. Many people today feel weak because they are tired, hurting, or overwhelmed. Jesus' teaching speaks directly to them. Feeling weak does not mean you lack strength. It may mean you are carrying something heavy with faith. Jesus showed that strength often looks like continuing when quitting would be easier, trusting when clarity is absent, and loving when the heart is wounded. In redefining strength through suffering, Jesus gave hope to all who feel powerless. He showed that God works most powerfully not through dominance, but through surrendered love. Strength shaped by suffering is not loud, aggressive, or proud. It is steady, faithful, and enduring. This is the strength that changes lives, heals hearts, and reflects the very nature of Christ. Jesus never allowed suffering to have the final word. While he took pain seriously, acknowledged grief honestly, and endured suffering fully, he consistently pointed beyond it. The heart of Jesus' teaching is not centered on pain, but on hope that rises after pain. The cross was real, brutal, and devastating, but it was not the end of the story. Jesus taught that suffering may shape a chapter of life, but it does not define the ending. When Jesus spoke about hardship, he always connected it to a greater promise. He told his followers, "In this world you will have trouble." But he did not stop there. He continued, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." This is not a denial of suffering. It is a declaration that suffering does not have ultimate authority. Jesus revealed that pain is temporary, but God's purpose is eternal. The resurrection stands as the clearest message Jesus ever gave about suffering. After betrayal, injustice, torture, and death, life emerged, hope returned, meaning was restored. The resurrection does not erase the suffering that came before it, but it transforms it. The scars remained on Jesus' resurrected body, yet they no longer spoke of defeat. They spoke of victory, love, and redemption. This teaches us something essential. God does not waste suffering. He redeems it. Jesus taught that what appears broken can be made new. What feels lost can be restored. What seems meaningless can carry eternal significance. Many people fear that their suffering defines them forever, but Jesus' resurrection declares the opposite. Pain does not get the final word. Failure does not get the final word. Death itself does not get the final word. God does. Jesus taught his followers to live with resurrection hope even before resurrection arrives. This kind of hope does not depend on circumstances improving quickly. It is rooted in trust that God is working even when progress is invisible. Jesus spoke of seeds buried in the ground, appearing lifeless, yet destined to grow. This image mirrors suffering. Pain often feels like burial, like something has ended. But Jesus taught that burial can be the beginning of transformation. Resurrection hope changes how suffering is endured. It does not remove grief, but it anchors it. It does not silence questions, but it sustains faith through them. Jesus showed that waiting is not wasted time. Silence is not abandonment. Darkness is not the absence of God. The resurrection assures us that God can bring life out of places that appear dead. Jesus also taught that hope is not naive optimism. It is courageous trust. He did not promise that every wound would be healed immediately, but he promised that nothing surrendered to God would be lost. Some healing happens in this life. Some healing unfolds slowly. Some healing is completed beyond this world. Jesus taught that eternity reframes suffering. What feels unbearable now will not last forever. What feels overwhelming now will not define the future. This does not minimize present pain, it gives it perspective. Jesus' final teaching on suffering is not an explanation, but an invitation. He invites people to trust him with their pain, their confusion, and their fear. He invites them to believe that love is stronger than suffering, light is stronger than darkness, and life is stronger than death. Through his resurrection, Jesus declared that hope is not wishful thinking, it is grounded in reality. Because he lives, suffering does not have the final word. Because he lives, despair is not permanent. Because he lives, broken hearts can heal. Jesus' message is clear. Suffering is real, but it is not ultimate. Pain is powerful, but it is not sovereign. Love, grace, and redemption endure beyond suffering. When all else falls away, God remains. And that is why, even in the midst of suffering, Jesus taught humanity to hope.